All right, so this will be our second lab unit that I want to run through. And essentially what we're doing to sort of complement what we're doing in lecture is our bones, articulations, and muscles. Same stuff we're going over in lecture, but here obviously it's more just about identifying the different structures as opposed to, of course, the physiology of how these structures work, which we do in lecture. So I've included these first few slides, just sort of some background information, some terminology you're going to be coming across as you identify these different structures, different muscle actions like flexion and extension, abduction, adduction, rotation, so forth and so on, that you're going to want to become familiar with, but I will not be having like a muscle or bone terminology section on the exam. So in other words, it would be useful for you to understand like what a trochanter is versus a tubercle, or what flexion versus extension is, because you're going to be using those terms as part of identifying these different structures, but I will not have a separate section. This exam will be strictly identification, identifying bones and different sites on bones, different features of articulations and different muscles, all from an image that's included in this lab manual. So I'll run through a handful of these so you can get a feel for how it goes. But once you do, one is pretty much rinse and repeat through the rest of these bones and muscles and articulations. All right, so for instance, the first thing you have here that we'll look at, and we're going to be doing the appendicular skeleton. Next unit, actually, the third lab unit will be the axial skeleton, which is like your core, like your skull and vertebrae. Here we're doing the appendicular skeleton, so like your arms and legs and pelvis, etc. So all those bones, joints, muscles associated with those bones, etc., is what we're looking at in this second lab unit. So, for instance, the first thing we have here is the pelvic girdle. So we have, this is actually three bones that have fused together. As you can see in sort of this color-coded image here, you have the ilium, which is the top portion of the bone, the pubis, which is the lower anterior portion, and then the ischium, which is the lower posterior portion. And so it's basically divided into three parts, but it's all fused together. And so as you can see, you have three parts that you have to identify. And I will use these pictures here to the right, most likely these pictures, for you to identify these structures. So for instance, if I have an arrow pointing to this big opening here, okay, that's the acetabulum there. Another really significant one is the greater sciatic notch, which you can see right here, right? So anyway, it's pretty straightforward. I would have, you can use these images in the lab manual. You should be able to find everything that's in the box to the left and this picture to the right. And that's pretty much how to go through the rest of these. And then I will use an unlabeled image, like the one you see right here, to have you identify these different structures. So it's pretty straightforward. It's just sort of a search and find mission for these different sites and committing them to memory. Probably be useful to practice these things. If you look at the tutoring web page, they have a lot of unlabeled images that might be easy, a nice way for you just to sort of drill in identifying these different structures, where you just sort of can fill it in as if you were, would do that on an exam. Also, tutoring has lots of other good sessions, information and sessions you can take advantage of. 3x5 index cards are a great way to sort of drill and practice this information, where you could write, the bone, the ilium on the front side, and then on the back you can have the acetabulum, iliac crest, greater sciatic, so forth and so on, and have all that information there. So that would be a good way to possibly roll through that as well. All right, so then you just, make sure you have all of these ones listed in this box here, all the sites associated with the ilium, ischium, and pubis, and then you just move on to the next one. So that would be on to the femur. Same deal here. I'll use this unlabeled image on the exam, and you need to identify all these sites associated with the femur: head, neck, shaft, greater trochanter, linea aspera, et cetera, et cetera. And so For instance, if I have, an arrow pointing right here, it's saying, what is this site? You would write the lateral condyle of the femur or whatever it is, and so you'll be able to use that. Again, in the actual lab time, we pretty much have bone models, obviously, that you would be going through and identifying these, and I would have the bone out on the table and have the bone labeled where you'd identify the different structures. So similar thing, but instead of actually using models, of course, we're going to use these images. And so that's how we'll do it. So you just continue on through the same deal, the tibia and the fibula, the lower leg, identifying all these sites, head, tibial tuberosity, medial malleolus, so forth and so on. Roll through those. I'm going to do the ankle and the foot. So again, these pictures have a lot more things labeled. The things that you have to identify are the things that I have listed in the boxes. So that's what you want to focus on. So you want to focus on all these tarsal bones, of course, calcaneus, talus, navicular, and you can see all those things are labeled right here, cuboid, so forth and so on. So it should be pretty straightforward in terms of identifying those. And again, I will use these unlabeled pictures on the exam. All right. Next, we have our first joint, and you want to identify the different bones of the joint. Of course, for the joint, for instance, we have the distal end of the femur, proximal end of the tibia, and proximal end of the fibula, as well as patella. These are all included as part of the knee joint. And then you have these different tendons and ligaments that you want to identify, as well as the medial and lateral meniscus. You guys know by now, meniscus pads are the thick fibrocartilage pads that cushion the joint. And so you want to identify all those structures. So again, I have these nice pictures here. This is what you need to know, all the different sites and features of this articulation, and I will use these pictures to have you identify those things, those different structures on the exam. All right, on to muscles of the lower extremity. So this is where it gets a little bit different, in terms of not only do you have to identify the muscle itself from this picture, kind of just like we did on the last one, but you also need to give me origin, insertion, and action. So for instance, on this first one, the psoas major, you can see the psoas major is labeled right here. So if I have this image on the exam and I have an arrow pointing to this one, I say identify this muscle. And you would write or type in the little box, psoas major, right? But then I could also ask you, what is the origin of that muscle? And you'd have to write thoracic and lumbar vertebrae. Or I could ask you the insertion, you write or type lesser trochanter of the femur in your dialog box. Or I could ask the action, what is the muscle action of this muscle? Flex its hips, so forth and so on. So again, these images include lots of pictures. You just need to identify the ones that highlighted specifically in the boxes. All right, and then apply those to the pictures. Now, I think most every picture coordinates with the slide. You may have to hop around a few to find the exact muscle. But like, for instance, on this slide, both the psoas major and the iliacus, you can see very easily on this image to the right. All right, so this is one of the more challenging parts of this is committing all of these muscle memory. So not only do you have to identify them on these pictures, of course, in lab, we would have leg models and arm models, and you'd be identifying the muscles in that way. But here you can use this image. If I have an arrow pointing to it, you got to tell me the muscles, but you also have to give me the action, origin, insertion. So another really good way to do this would be to have, the muscle written on one side of a 3x5 card, flip it over, you could have action, origin, insertion, and boom, that's a really easy way to sort of drill through these in practice. And that's really what it is. It's really just going to be practice and repetition in terms of mastering all these different muscles. So again, you just sort of rinse and repeat through the different muscles. Here we have muscles that move the thigh, like the gracilis, which is a medial muscle, originates off the pubis, inserts at the medial surface of the tibia and involved in knee flexion, but also adduction as well as medial rotation. So it's a muscle that's doing quite a bit. So again, you have to have all that information. So if I have an arrow pointing to that muscle, you'd write or type in your box gracilis. And then also I could say also, what is the origin of this muscle? You type pubis or whatever the information is. Okay? And you have to have all the information. If, for instance, you can only remember knee flexion for the gracilis, I would give you partial credit. But if you want to get the full 2 points, you have to have everything listed there. All right. So you just roll through the muscles in the same fashion, being able to identify them on the image. And I'll use these actual images here on your lab practical exam, and also action, origin, insertion. We have the glutes next. Gluteus maximus is the more superficial. The medius is just beneath it. And if you're curious, where it says leg 3, man 17, that is just referencing, they're labeled on the actual models in our lab. So that's not really relevant here if you're curious about that. But you can see very easily here, like the gluteus maximus, gluteus medius. And so again, I would use this image right here. Have you tell me what the muscle is. If I'm pointing an arrow to this one, you'd say gluteus maximus, but then you also have to give me the action, origin, insertion as well. Some or all of that you would have to have. All right. I mean, in other words, I may only ask the origin, or I may only ask the action, or I could ask all of it. But regardless, for your studies, you need to learn all of it. All right. So then you just continue on through the sartorius, quadriceps femoris. Quads are 4 muscle, obviously quad means 4. Rectus femoris, vastus medialis, vastus lateralis. One of the muscles is just beneath the rectus femoris, which you really can't see on this image. So I'll just have you do 3 out of the 4 muscles, but make sure I have all the action, origin, insertion. Onto the hamstrings, biceps femoris, semitendinosus, semimembranosus. There's 3 on the back of the leg, which you can see very easily on this picture. And these are primarily knee flexors. Some are involved in hip extension also, but primarily knee flexors for the hamstrings. Move on to the muscles of the lower extremity, like the gastroc and soleus, tibialis anterior. You can see those for the most part in this image. You need action, origin, insertion as well. All right, so that's the lower extremity of the muscles. Now we're going to move on to the bones and the muscles and articulations of the upper extremity. So we start with the scapula. Scapula is your shoulder blade. And as you can see, as I've included on this in the box, right, those are all the things you have to know for the scapula. So like the glenoid fossa cavity, you can see here, that's where the head of the humerus articulates and forms your shoulder articulation. The acromion process, you can see here, as you on the last exam, right, I had you tell me what the point of the shoulder was, the acromion. You can see that site right there. So anyway, so you just roll through all these, use these images. I'll have these images on the exam, and you have to be able to identify all those portions of the scapula. Clavicle is pretty straightforward, just an acromial on the sternal end. That's your collarbone, right? That articulates with the scapula as well, which we'll see here on this next slide with the shoulder joint. I go over the shoulder and knee joint pretty well in lecture, but you can also see some of the things here. The bones, of course, as I just mentioned, are the scapula, clavicle, and humerus coming together, and the ligaments you have to identify. Those are, you can see them pretty easily on this image, like the acromioclavicular ligament. But right, ligaments connect bone to bone, right? So if the clavicle and the acromion process are connected by ligament, and of course that means it's the acromioclavicular ligament. So again, pretty straightforward in terms of identifying those different structures. And so those are just the things you need. Again, there's more items listed on this image. What you need to focus on are the things in the boxes, and that's consistent throughout the lab presentation. Then on to the arm, same thing here, the humerus, which is your upper arm bone that articulates with the scapula, forms that ball and socket joint. You just want to be able to identify all those structures: head, greater tubercle, lesser tubercle, deltoid tuberosity, so forth and so on. Identify all those structures, and then you move on to the forearm bones, right? Your lower arm, radius and ulna. This articulates with the hand, obviously, as well as the humerus proximally. And so you want to be able to identify all those different sites as they're listed in this image. And so you just keep rolling through. Onto the hand. Hand is neat to study because the way usually I like to think about it is there are two rows, a distal and a proximal row. Proximal, of course, is closer, and so you start, for instance, with the navicular scaphoid and just move through that entire row, and you'll get through the lunate, triquetrum, and pisiform. You move on to the distal row, and that's where you're going to see the trapezium, trapezoid, capitate, and hamate bones, and so those are important carpal bones that you want to be able to have. And I would use, again, this image. You can see everything with that. Then you also have the metacarpals and the phalanges. Metacarpals, there are 5 of those, as you can see. And then the phalanges, you have typically have 3. You have a proximal and middle and distal on 4 of the fingers. But at your thumb or the pollex, you only have proximal and distal, right? Don't have the 3rd one. So those are the different structures in the hand you want to make sure that you can identify. And then you move on to the muscles of the upper extremity. This will be the last part of it. Identifying these different structures, for instance, the serratus anterior. You can see that labeled in this image. Action, origin, insertion as well. Pectoralis minor, trapezius. You can see part of the trapezius here. It's also seen pretty well from the posterior aspect. And identify action, origin, insertion. Move on to the pectoralis major. That is, of course, pretty straightforward to see that one. Origin, insertion as well. Then some of the muscles that are more in the back or the lateral aspect with the teres major, the lats, and the deltoid. You should be able to see all those structures in that image. And then the rotator cuff muscles. The subscapularis is probably the only one you're not going to be able to see on this image. So I probably want to ask you about the subscapularis. There are 4 rotator cuff muscles. 1 of them is anterior, 3 of them are posterior primarily, but they all come off of the scapula. And so the subscapularis you really can't see that well. But the ones you can see really well are the supraspinatus, infraspinatus, and teres minor, which you can see all in this picture. And basically, if you learn the scapula, again, it's one of the reasons we study and teach these muscles in conjunction with the bones, is that if you're understanding your scapular anatomy, you learn about the scapular spine, which leads into the acromion process. And so there's a little fossa above the scapular spine, there's a little fossa below the scapular spine. And so accordingly enough, there's a muscle there. Supraspinatus means supra, above the spine, the scapular spine. Infraspinatus, of course, is infra, beneath the spine. And as you can see, most of these are doing rotation, except the supraspinatus, which makes sense because it's a little bit more superior than it is posterior as it runs along that scapular. If you look at the scapula, it sort of straightens out a little bit. And so that's going to be involved a little bit more in abduction. But the infraspinatus and teres minor are more true lateral rotators, which is why they call them part of the rotator cuff muscle group. So those are the rotator cuff muscles. Biceps and triceps, I think most people probably know those muscles. You should be able to see them pretty easily on that picture. Brachialis, brachioradialis, which is your sort of your thumbs up muscle. If you lift your thumb up, you can see that on your arm as you flex your forearm. Pronator teres as well as a pronator muscle. So you should be able to see all those muscles. And then finally, flexors and extenders that move the wrists and the digits, essentially. You have a series of flexors like the flexor pollicis brevis and flexor carpi ulnaris. And if you look, they all say flexion, right? Which you think would make sense, right? Flexor, when you think of the action, is going to flex something, right? But you'll be surprised the number of people that will get the muscle right. Like I'll have an arrow pointing to the flexor carpi radialis, and they'll get that right. And then I'll say, what's the action? And they'll put extends to the wrist, right? So make sense of it, right? If it's a flexor carpi ulnaris, then it's going to be a flexor, the ulna, right? It's going to be the one going sort of along with the ulna bone. So as you're working through these, one of the objectives I feel like is to make sure you're making sense and understanding and pulling everything together, which again is why we teach these things sort of all together with the bones, the muscles, and the articulations. I think it's a really great way to bring all this information together. So make sure you do that when you're identifying these muscles. And then same thing on the back, right? Extensors, extensor carpi radialis, extensor carpi ulnaris, extensor digitorum, etc. They're all extending, right? Extending the wrist or extending the wrist and the fingers because that's what they're called. They're called extensors, right? So anyway, so that is the last slide. So it's quite a bit of information on this lab. Again, 3x5 cards are a really good way to do this. Getting unlabeled images is another really good way to practice this. And just sort of roll through them. It's really going to be just sort of good old-fashioned repetition, right? Just rinse and repeat, do it again. Try to get yourself in front of this stuff as much as you can. All right? All right, well, that is it for Lab 2 overview.